"Sit down." The words cracked through the chamber like a whip, sharp and sudden, slicing through the low hum of side conversations and the rustle of papers. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if the walls had pulled closer to listen. Heads turned in unison toward the source, Steve Scalise, leaning forward, his jaw set, eyes narrowed into a glare that could cut glass. Gasps rippled across the room, small but unmistakable. A few aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their pens hovering mid-note. Cameras, already trained on the dais, zoomed in instinctively, catching every flicker of tension. The sound of a chair creaking somewhere in the back felt deafening in the sudden stillness. And then the lens found her, Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a twitch. Her posture remained upright, her hands resting lightly on the desk before her, as if she were weighing the moment in her palms. Her gaze met Scalise's with a calm so steady it was almost defiant, not the kind of defiance that shouts, but the kind that waits, unshaken, for the storm to pass. The contrast was cinematic. On one side, a man bristling with visible irritation, his voice still echoing in the minds of those present. On the other, a woman radiating composure, her silence louder than any retort. Somewhere in the press gallery, a reporter's fingers flew across a keyboard. A staffer's eyes darted to the clock, as if marking the exact second the temperature in the room changed. The tension wasn't just between two people, it was in the air, in the way the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Scalise's glare didn't waver, but neither did hers. It was a standoff without movement, a clash without words, and yet everyone watching could feel the weight of what was about to happen. In that suspended moment, the chamber wasn't just a room of lawmakers, it was an arena. Every spectator in the seats, behind the cameras, and soon across the internet, was waiting for the next move. But no one in that chamber, not even Scalise, could have predicted what would happen next. The morning had begun like so many others in the committee room, a slow churn of procedural motions, prepared statements, and the faint clatter of coffee cups against saucers. But beneath the surface, tension was already coiling. The docket was stacked with contentious issues, each one a fault line in the nation's political landscape. Members shuffled papers with the kind of focus that masked unease, knowing the day's debates would be anything but routine. From the outset, the exchanges were sharper than usual. Questions were loaded, answers clipped. The air carried that electric charge that precedes a storm. On one side of the aisle, voices pressed for urgency, for accountability, for a reckoning with truths too long ignored. On the other, a wall of resistance, polished, procedural, and unyielding. Steve Scalise had been in this arena long enough to recognize the rhythm of a fight, and today he was leaning into it. His interjections came quicker, his tone more pointed. He wasn't just challenging policy, he was asserting dominance, staking out the space as his own. Each time he spoke, his words landed with the weight of someone accustomed to being heard without question. Jasmine Crockett, seated a few chairs away, listened. She had been through enough of these sessions to know when the temperature was rising, when the debate was shifting from substance to spectacle. Her eyes tracked each exchange, her pen moving in deliberate strokes across her notes. She wasn't rushing to speak. She was waiting, measuring, letting the moment ripen. The divide in the room was more than political. It was cultural, generational, even personal. For some, the day's arguments were about legislation. For others, they were about identity, belonging, and the right to stand in that chamber as an equal. Every raised eyebrow, every dismissive gesture carried the weight of history. As the hours wore on, the interruptions grew bolder. Scalise's voice cut through others mid-sentence, his body language telegraphing impatience. The subtext was clear. He was in control here, but control is a fragile thing, and in that room it was beginning to slip. Outside the chamber, the world was watching. Clips from earlier exchanges were already circulating online, snippets of sharp words and tense stares. Comment threads swelled with anticipation, each viewer sensing that something bigger was brewing. The hashtags were forming before the moment had even arrived. Crockett knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been told, in ways subtle and blunt, to take up less space. It was about the unspoken rules that dictated who could speak with authority and who was expected to yield. And she knew that when her moment came, it would have to be more than a rebuttal, it would have to be a statement. The murmurs in the gallery grew quieter as the exchanges sharpened. Aides leaned in toward their principals, whispering reminders, passing notes. The clock ticked forward, but the air felt suspended, as if the entire room was holding its breath for the inevitable collision. And then, with the nation watching, she rose. Steve Scalise had built his career on a certain kind of presence, the kind that filled a room before he even spoke. Colleagues described him as confident, but in the chamber, that confidence often sharpened into something harder, more combative. He was a man who understood the theater of politics, who knew that in a crowded arena of voices, volume and certainty could be as persuasive as facts. From his earliest days in public office, Scalise had cultivated an image of the unyielding fighter. He positioned himself as a guardian of his principles, someone who would not bend under pressure. That resolve earned him loyalty from his allies, but it also drew fire from opponents who saw in his style a refusal to listen, a tendency to bulldoze rather than build consensus. There were moments, captured in grainy committee footage and clipped into viral sound bites, where his tone crossed from assertive into something more pointed. In one hearing, his interruption of a witness mid-sentence drew murmurs from the gallery. In another, his sharp dismissal of a colleague's amendment was met with visible frustration from across the aisle. Each time, Scalise seemed unfazed, as though the friction was not a hazard but a tool. He had a knack for framing his opponents' arguments in ways that made them seem naive or impractical, often with a wry smile that suggested he'd already won the point before the debate began. For supporters, this was part of his charm, the quick wit, the refusal to be cornered. For critics, it was a sign of arrogance, a performance that valued dominance over dialogue. Scalise's rise through the ranks was marked by these moments. He was not the kind of politician who faded into the background. He thrived in the spotlight, especially when the stakes were high. In televised debates, he leaned forward in his chair, gesturing with precision, his voice carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Even in quieter settings, there was an intensity to his presence, a sense that he was always calculating the next move. But the same qualities that made him formidable also made him polarizing. His detractors pointed to a pattern: the clipped retorts, the strategic interruptions, the way he could pivot a question into an attack. They argued that his style left little room for genuine exchange, that it was less about finding solutions and more about winning the moment. In the committee room, these traits were on full display. Scalise often set the tone early, establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with. He would challenge procedural points, press for clarifications that put his opponents on the defensive, and use pauses not as breaks but as pressure, letting silence hang just long enough to make the other side uneasy. There was a rhythm to it, a choreography honed over years. He knew when to raise his voice, when to lean back and let a pointed remark linger. He understood the power of body language, the crossed arms, the raised eyebrow, the slow shake of the head that could undermine an argument without a single word. And yet, for all his skill, there were cracks in the armor. In moments when the pushback was stronger than expected, when an opponent refused to yield, his composure could tighten into something more brittle. The smile would fade, the interruptions would come faster, the tone would sharpen. It was in those moments that critics saw not just confidence, but a need to reassert control. Over the years, these flashes had drawn criticism from across the political spectrum. Editorials questioned whether his approach fostered the kind of discourse the public deserved. Commentators debated whether his tactics were a sign of strength or a symptom of a deeper unwillingness to engage on equal terms. Still, Scalise remained undeterred. To him, politics was not a place for hesitation. It was a contest of wills, and he had no intention of losing. His supporters admired that resolve, seeing in it a reflection of their own frustrations with what they viewed as political gridlock. His opponents braced for it, knowing that any exchange with him would be a test of endurance as much as of ideas. On that day in the committee room, all of these elements, the confidence, the combativeness, the unyielding posture, were present. He had entered the session ready to assert himself, to steer the conversation, to remind everyone of the weight his voice carried. But this time, his usual tactics would meet an opponent unlike any he'd faced before. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name was etched into the headlines, she was a young woman navigating a world that didn't always make room for her voice. She grew up in a working-class family where every dollar was stretched, where the measure of a person wasn't in their title but in how they treated others. Her parents taught her that dignity wasn't something granted by others. It was something you carried within yourself, even when the world tried to strip it away. In school, she was the student who asked the questions others were too shy to raise, not to challenge for the sake of defiance, but because she believed that truth deserved daylight. Teachers noticed her quick mind, the way she could take a complicated problem and cut straight to its core. That sharpness would become her signature, but it was tempered by something rarer, an instinct to listen before she spoke. Her path to public service wasn't a straight line. She worked jobs that demanded long hours and little recognition, learning firsthand the quiet struggles of people who kept the country running without ever being seen. She saw how systems could fail those who needed them most, and how the law in the wrong hands could be wielded as a weapon instead of a shield. Law school was where her resolve crystallized. Surrounded by voices that often assumed authority belonged to the loudest in the room, she learned to wield precision like a blade. Her professors came to expect that when she raised her hand, the conversation would shift. She didn't just memorize statutes, she understood their human cost. As a young attorney, she took on cases others avoided, defending those who couldn't afford the kind of representation that wins on paper but loses in humanity. In cramped offices and crowded courtrooms, she stood beside clients who had been told, in 100 different ways, that they didn't matter. She made sure they knew they did. Her reputation grew, sharp wit that could slice through the most convoluted argument, legal precision that left opponents scrambling, and a poise that made it impossible to rattle her. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. She let the weight of her words do the work. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't for the spotlight, though it found her quickly. It was because she understood that the laws she argued in court were born in rooms where too few voices spoke for the people she'd spent her career defending. She carried with her the stories of single mothers working double shifts, of immigrants navigating a maze of bureaucracy, of young people told to temper their ambitions because of where they came from. In the legislature, she became known for her meticulous preparation. Colleagues learned that if Crockett was speaking on a bill, she had read every line, traced every implication, and anticipated every counterpoint. Her speeches were not just arguments, they were narratives, weaving policy into the lived experiences of those it would touch. But it wasn't just her intellect that set her apart, it was her composure. In hearings where tempers flared and voices rose, she remained steady. Even when interrupted, even when spoken over, she didn't let frustration dictate her tone. That calm was not passivity, it was control. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew that the most devastating blows are often delivered without haste. Her identity was inseparable from her politics. As a black woman in spaces still dominated by men, she understood that every word she spoke carried layers of meaning. She knew the unspoken expectations, to be deferential, to avoid being labeled angry, and she refused to let those constraints define her. Instead, she redefined the space around her, showing that strength could be measured in restraint as much as in fire. Outside the chamber, she connected with constituents in ways that transcended policy. She showed up at community events not for photo opportunities, but to listen. She remembered names, asked about families, followed up on concerns. People saw in her not just a representative, but an advocate, someone who would carry their voices into rooms they could not enter themselves. Her rise was not without resistance. There were those who underestimated her, who mistook her calm for weakness, who believed they could talk over her and move on. They learned quickly that she was not easily dismissed. She had faced harder battles than a raised voice across a committee table. By the time she took her seat in that fateful session, she had weathered storms that would have sent others retreating. She had been tested in courtrooms, in campaigns, in the quiet moments when the weight of responsibility pressed hardest. And each time, she emerged with her dignity intact. That day, as the exchanges grew sharper and the tension in the room thickened, she recognized the familiar pattern, the attempt to diminish, to silence, to assert control through volume. But she also recognized something else, an opportunity, not just to respond, but to turn the moment into something larger than herself. She knew the cameras were rolling, that the words spoken in that room would echo far beyond its walls. She knew that somewhere, someone watching would see themselves in her restraint, in her resolve, in her refusal to be moved by disrespect. And when the moment came, she didn't just defend herself, she made history. The exchange began with the faintest tremor, a clipped interjection from Scalise as Crockett laid out her point. It was the kind of interruption that could be brushed aside in another setting, but here, in the charged air of the committee room, it landed like a spark on dry tinder. Crockett paused just for a beat, her eyes flicking toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply resumed, her tone steady, her words deliberate, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Scalise leaned forward, his voice cutting in again, this time sharper, more insistent. "That's not the issue here," he said, gesturing toward the papers in front of him. His words overlapped hers, the sound of two voices colliding in the air. The chair tried to restore order, but the rhythm of the back-and-forth had already taken hold. Crockett, unshaken, waited for the noise to subside before continuing. She didn't match his volume, she matched his persistence. Each time he tried to steer the conversation away, she brought it back, tethering the discussion to the facts with quiet precision. Around them, the room began to shift. Colleagues leaned in, sensing the undercurrent. Aides stopped scribbling notes and looked up. The gallery stilled, the faint hum of whispered side conversations fading into silence. The cameras, already trained on the dais, inched closer, their lenses narrowing in on the two figures at the center of the storm. Scalise's interruptions grew more frequent, his tone edged with impatience. He gestured broadly, his voice rising as though sheer force could bend the moment to his will. But Crockett's composure was unbreakable. She answered each point with clarity, her cadence unhurried, her gaze unwavering. It was a study in contrasts, one voice pressing harder, faster, trying to dominate the space, the other holding steady, refusing to be pulled into the spiral. The more he pushed, the more her restraint became its own kind of power. At one point, he cut in mid-sentence, his words tumbling over hers. She stopped speaking, not in defeat, but in a deliberate pause that left his voice hanging in the air, exposed. When he finished, she resumed exactly where she had left off, as if the interruption had never happened. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that control of the room was not his alone to claim. The tension was no longer just between them. It had seeped into every corner of the chamber. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way the air seemed to grow heavier with each exchange. Even those who had entered the room indifferent to the day's agenda were now locked in, watching the duel unfold. Scalise's frustration began to show in the tightness of his jaw, the clipped edges of his words. Crockett, by contrast, seemed to draw strength from the pressure. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had been here before, who knew that the most enduring victories are not won in a single blow, but in the refusal to yield. Every time she spoke, she anchored her points in the record, making it harder for him to dismiss them. Every time he interrupted, she let the moment breathe just long enough for the imbalance to be noticed. It was a masterclass in turning an opponent's tactics against them without ever breaking the rules of decorum. The room was now a taut wire, stretched to its limit. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. Somewhere beyond those walls, viewers were already leaning toward their screens, sensing that the exchange was building toward something more than just another committee squabble. And then came the line that would echo far beyond the chamber walls. For a moment after Scalise's last interruption, the room seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. His words still hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, but the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Crockett's pen, resting on the desk before her, lay perfectly still. Her eyes, steady and unblinking, locked on him as though she were studying not just his words, but the intent behind them. Then without haste, she pushed back her chair. The sound was soft, but in the charged stillness, it might as well have been a gavel strike. Every head turned. She rose to her full height, shoulders squared, chin lifted not in defiance, but in the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what they are about to do. The murmurs began immediately, a low ripple through the chamber. Aides leaned toward one another, whispering. The cameras adjusted, lenses tightening to capture every detail. The set of her jaw, the calm in her eyes, the way her hands rested lightly on the desk as she began to speak. Her voice was measured, deliberate. "Mr. Scalise," she began, her tone neither raised nor rushed, "I will not sit down." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a verdict. She let them hang there, unadorned, before continuing. She spoke of the issue at hand, threading her argument with precision, each point anchored in fact. But beneath the policy and procedure, there was something more, a current of lived experience, of battles fought in rooms just like this one, where the rules were bent to favor the loudest voice. She didn't need to name it. Everyone in the room could feel it. Scalise shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now tempered by the realization that she was not going to be rattled. She met his gaze without flinching, her words flowing with the steady cadence of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. At one point she paused, not because she had lost her place, but because she understood the power of silence. The chamber was utterly still. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. She let the pause stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to settle, then continued, her voice cutting cleanly through the air. She dismantled his points one by one, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for rebuttal. Each fact was laid out like a brick, building a wall of unassailable logic between her position and his. She didn't rush to the end. She let the argument breathe, each sentence a deliberate step toward the inevitable conclusion. As she spoke, the body language in the room began to shift. Members who had been leaning back in their chairs now sat forward. A few nodded subtly, their expressions betraying a reluctant respect. Even those who disagreed with her politically could not deny the mastery of her delivery. When she reached her final point, she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she lowered it slightly, forcing the room to lean in. "I stand," she said, "because my constituents sent me here to speak for them, and I will not be told to sit down when their voices deserve to be heard." For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no applause, no murmurs, just the echo of her words in the stillness. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a single clap. Another followed, and then the sound swelled, rolling through the chamber like a wave. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory applause of routine proceedings. It was sustained, rising, punctuated by the scrape of chairs as members stood. Some were her allies, others were not, but in that moment the lines blurred. The ovation was for the clarity, the composure, the refusal to be diminished. Scalise sat back, his expression unreadable, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The balance of the moment had tipped. Crockett didn't bask in it. She simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response without breaking her composure. The applause went on longer than anyone expected. Cameras captured it from every angle: the standing members, the nods of approval, the murmurs of agreement. Clips would later show the subtle details. The way one member across the aisle mouthed, "Well said." The faint smile from a colleague who had been silent all session. The look of quiet pride from those who had been waiting for someone to say exactly what she had just said. When the noise finally subsided, she returned to her seat with the same calm she had risen with. No triumphant gestures, no lingering glances, just the quiet certainty of someone who had done what they came to do. The chair moved to continue the proceedings, but the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations were hushed, eyes still drawn to her. Even as the agenda moved forward, the moment lingered, replaying in the minds of those who had witnessed it. In the press gallery, reporters were already drafting their leads. On the floor, aides tapped out quick messages to their offices. Outside, the first clips were being uploaded, the captions already framing it as a defining moment. Crockett sat with her notes in front of her, listening as the next speaker took the floor. But there was a stillness about her, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and left the air clearer than before. She had not raised her voice. She had not matched interruption with interruption. She had simply stood, spoken, and let the truth do the work. And in doing so, she had turned an attempt to silence her into a moment that would be remembered far beyond the walls of that chamber. But the real shock came hours later, when the outside world weighed in. The moment the gavel struck to close the session, the chamber's energy spilled outward like a wave breaking free of its walls. Within minutes, the first clips of Crockett's stand were online: shaky phone footage from the gallery, crisp feeds from the official cameras, even grainy screen recordings from live streams. Each angle told the same story: a woman refusing to be diminished, her words cutting through the noise with surgical precision. By the time she stepped out into the hallway, the hashtags had already begun to form. Stand with Crockett. She stood. Sit down Scalise. They spread like wildfire, leaping from Twitter to Instagram, from TikTok to Facebook. The clip was everywhere, in news feeds sandwiched between celebrity gossip and breaking headlines, in group chats where friends sent it with nothing more than a string of fire emojis, in political forums where it was dissected frame by frame. On TikTok, creators stitched her speech into their own videos, some offering commentary, others simply letting the moment play uninterrupted, their faces lit with admiration. Instagram Reels paired her words with swelling orchestral music, turning the exchange into a cinematic montage. On Twitter, journalists posted the transcript alongside still shots of her standing, chin high, eyes locked forward. The numbers climbed at a pace that startled even seasoned political watchers. 1 million views in the first hour, 3 million by the end of the afternoon. By nightfall, it was inescapable, the kind of viral moment that transcended political niches and entered the bloodstream of the culture. Influencers who rarely touched politics weighed in. A lifestyle blogger with 2 million followers posted, "This is how you hold your ground with grace." A popular sports commentator tweeted, "That's championship composure right there." Musicians, actors, and activists shared the clip, each adding their own caption, some fiery, some reflective, all amplifying the moment. Cable news producers scrambled to book her for interviews. Late-night hosts worked the exchange into their monologues, some playing the clip in full before delivering punchlines aimed squarely at Scalise's outburst. Editorial boards debated the deeper meaning. Was this a turning point in how women in politics respond to public disrespect? Was it a sign of shifting norms in congressional decorum? But outside the punditry, the reaction was more visceral. In living rooms and break rooms, people replayed the moment not for analysis, but for the feeling it gave them: the rush of seeing someone stand tall in the face of condescension, the satisfaction of watching composure outlast bluster. In communities far from the marble halls of Washington, the clip became a conversation starter. Teachers played it for civics classes. Parents showed it to their daughters. Activists used it to rally volunteers, framing it as proof that representation matters, that the right voice in the right moment can shift the narrative. Even some of her political opponents, when pressed by reporters, conceded that her delivery had been effective, a word that, in the coded language of politics, carried more weight than it seemed. The memes came next. One showed Crockett standing, overlaid with the caption, "This is my seat now." Another looped Scalise, "Sit down," followed by her calm rebuttal, set to the beat drop of a popular song. The humor didn't diminish the gravity. If anything, it spread the moment further, pulling in audiences who might never have clicked on a congressional hearing otherwise. By the end of the day, the story had shifted. It was no longer just about a heated exchange in a committee room. It had become a cultural moment, a shorthand for dignity under fire, for the power of measured words over raised voices. Commentators noted the symbolism. A black woman standing in a space where, for much of the nation's history, her presence would have been unthinkable, refusing to yield when told to sit. The image resonated beyond the specifics of the policy debate, tapping into deeper currents of identity, representation, and the ongoing struggle for respect in public life. In the swirl of attention, Crockett's team fielded interview requests, statement requests, invitations to speak at events. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, some congratulating her, others sharing their own stories of being told to sit down in boardrooms, classrooms, and family gatherings. Through it all, she remained composed. She thanked supporters, acknowledged the flood of messages, but didn't rush to capitalize on the moment. Those close to her knew why. For Crockett, the exchange had never been about scoring a viral clip. It had been about holding her ground in the moment it mattered, about making sure her constituents' voices were not drowned out. The applause in the chamber had been loud. The applause online was deafening. But in her mind, both were secondary to the principle at stake. And yet, for Crockett, the victory wasn't about the applause. When the cameras dimmed and the noise of the day began to fade, Jasmine Crockett's thoughts were not on the applause, nor on the trending hashtags that had carried her name across the digital landscape. She thought instead of the people who had sent her to that chamber, the ones whose stories she carried like a second heartbeat. In the quiet after the storm, she spoke to a small group of reporters gathered in the hallway. Her tone was the same as it had been in the chamber, calm, deliberate, unshaken. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about the principle that every voice, no matter where it comes from, deserves to be heard with respect." She reframed the moment not as a personal victory but as a lesson. Disrespect, she explained, is easy. It's the shortcut of those who fear the weight of another's words. Dignity, on the other hand, is hard. It requires patience, restraint, and the courage to stand tall even when the easier choice is to shout back. Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived that truth long before the cameras found her. She spoke of the countless times people are told, in boardrooms and classrooms, in offices and on factory floors, to sit down, sometimes in those exact words, sometimes in subtler ways. She reminded them that standing tall doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means refusing to let someone else decide your place. The reporters scribbled furiously, but Crockett wasn't speaking for their benefit. She was speaking for the young woman watching from her apartment, wondering if she should speak up in her next meeting. For the man who had been talked over one too many times in his workplace. For the student who had been told their perspective didn't matter. She wove the incident into a broader truth. That respect is not a courtesy reserved for the powerful, but a right owed to everyone. That truth, she said, is not partisan. It is not bound by geography or profession. It is the foundation of a society that values its people equally. Her voice softened as she spoke of the power of composure. "When you meet disrespect with dignity," she said, "you take away its power. You show that your worth isn't defined by someone else's temper or tone." The moment in the chamber, she explained, was not about winning an argument. It was about showing that there is another way to engage, one that doesn't sacrifice conviction for civility, but also doesn't mistake volume for strength. Her words resonated because they were not abstract. They were rooted in the image still fresh in everyone's mind. A woman standing, calm and unyielding, in the face of a command meant to diminish her. That image had already taken on a life of its own, but here she was, grounding it in a message that anyone could carry into their own lives. She urged people to remember that truth has a way of outlasting noise, that the measure of a person's strength is not how loudly they speak, but how firmly they hold to what is right. She reminded them that moments like these are not accidents, they are choices, made in the space between provocation and response. As she finished, there was no applause, no standing ovation, just a quiet understanding that the lesson had been delivered. The reporters lowered their pens, the aides shifted their weight, and somewhere in the minds of those listening, the seed of her message began to take root. Because in the end, the loudest voice isn't always the strongest. From the moment Steve Scalise's voice cut through the chamber with "sit down," to the instant Jasmine Crockett rose and delivered her calm, unshakable response, this was never just a clash of personalities. It was a test of composure, of conviction, of whether dignity could withstand the weight of public disrespect. And in that test, the answer was clear. Her stand was more than a rebuttal, it was a reminder that in politics, as in life, the measure of strength is not in how loudly you speak, but in how firmly you hold your ground. That respect is not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be claimed. That when someone tries to shrink your space, you have every right to stand taller. This moment will be remembered not because it went viral, but because it struck a chord deep in the hearts of those who have been told, in words or in silence, to take their seat and stay quiet. Crockett's choice to rise was a choice to say, for herself and for countless others, "I belong here. I will be heard." And now it's your turn. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of your own worth, if it lit even the smallest spark of courage in you, don't let it fade. Share this story. Talk about it with your friends, your family, your community. Let it be the start of a conversation about dignity, respect, and the power of standing tall. Subscribe for more stories that cut through the noise and remind us of what truly matters. Add your voice to this movement. Because the more we stand together, the harder it becomes for anyone to tell us to sit down.